Hi, happy Friday. Thanks for joining me. I'm Carla with Race to Walk, and it's time for weekly Bible study. And we are going to be talking about Passover and how it foreshadowed Jesus's first coming. But before we get started, a little bit about this channel here. We share good thoughts about good words, and on Tuesdays I post videos about books, and then on Fridays I host a live Bible study on Instagram and then upload that to YouTube. So if you're interested in that, be sure to like and subscribe to follow along for notifications. So anyway, so the past few weeks we have been studying Bible passages that relate to Easter. And so the first Bible study in the series a few weeks ago, we did one on Genesis and the fall and why Jesus had to come and die on the cross in the first place. And then the next week we did a study on the binding of Isaac, or when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and we talked about the implication of that and how it was much greater than just an act of obedience of one man. And then last week we did a study on the passage in Exodus where the leaders of the Israelites actually met with God on Mount Sinai, and they literally saw God and had a fellowship meal. So that actually happens after the first occurrence of Passover. But I wanted to share that first because, as we talked about in the very first Bible study, the purpose of the whole plan of redemption is so that we can be in communion with God once again. And that is the purpose. And so we see that when God called his people out of Egypt and delivered them from Egypt, they had an opportunity to be in fellowship with him. And God said, I will give you my rules and regulations so you can follow me. And then we see that there was this invitation for fellowship and communion. And this is what we covered last week. And they actually did meet with God. But then immediately after that, Moses went up on the mountains to get the 10 Commandments. He was gone for 40 days and 40 nights. And then when he came down, the Israelites were worshiping idols. This is the account of the golden calf. In just a little bit of time, and they were freaking out. And so after that sin, and they had told Moses, like, we don't want to speak to God. You speak to him for us. So even though there was this opportunity to have fellowship with God, in their sinful nature, they could not have that fellowship because the law was never enough. And as Paul tells us, the law was just basically a protection and a guard against the principalities of this world. We talked about that. Salvation was never in these sacrifices, or it was just to cover the sins that people did. This blood atonement just covered the sins, so the judgment for that sin could be pushed back. But salvation has always been through faith. And in Genesis 15:6 it says, and Abraham believed God, and God credited it to him as righteousness. As we studied in the Bible study on the binding of Isaac, Abraham actually believed God, so he had so much trust and so much faith in God that God would do what he said, because God told him that he would make him a great nation through Isaac. And he believed him so strongly that he believed, as Paul tells us, that he could have, even if he had sacrificed him, that he could have raised Isaac from the dead, even if he was sacrificed. He had that much faith in the goodness and the promises of God. And so Isaac had the faith for the resurrection, just as we who are Abraham's spiritual heirs have the faith in the resurrection. And Romans 10:9 says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is the Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved, right? That's salvation. So today we're going to be talking about Passover. Now, this whole series is to really kind of get an overview and a structure and an understanding of what it is that we are confessing that we believe when we're Christians. We're doing kind of the reason that we need, that we need a Savior, God's whole long plan of salvation. And now in Passover, so this actually happened before the occurrence that we studied last week, where the leaders met on Sinai. But this happened when the Israelites were brought out of Egypt. So they had been in Egypt for 400 years. They had been slaves for quite a chunk of that time. And so it says that they cried out to God for deliverance, and he heard them, and he sent them the deliverer in Moses. And I talked a little bit about this, that all of the 10 plagues were basically, they were coming against particular gods that the Egyptians worshiped. So the Egyptians had their own gods that they trusted in for protection and for blessings. And every single one of those plagues was a direct attack against those things that those gods were supposed to be over. And it was showing the Egyptians that that Yahweh was the Lord over all. So of the 10 plagues, the first 3 they affected both the Egyptians and the Israelites. Plagues 4 through 9 affected just the Egyptians. They didn't touch the Israelites. But the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn. And that affected whoever didn't have the blood of the lamb over the doorpost, on their doorpost. So whoever put their trust in deliverance, the deliverance from Yahweh, and followed his instructions, they would have that salvation. But if they didn't, whether they were an Israelite or an Egyptian, then they would lose the firstborn son. So the account of this is in Exodus chapter 12. While the Israelites were still in the land of Egypt, the Lord gave the following instructions to Moses and Aaron. From now on, this month will be the first month of the year for you. Announce to the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each family must choose a lamb or a young goat for a sacrifice. 1 animal for each household. If a family is too small to eat a whole animal, let them share with another family in the neighborhood to divide the animal according to the size of each family and how much they can eat. The animal you select must be a 1-year-old male, either a sheep or a goat with no defects. Take special care of this chosen animal until the evening of the 14th day of the month, of this first month. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel must slaughter their lamb or young goat at twilight. They are to take some of the blood and smear it on the sides and the top of the door frames of the houses where they eat the animal. That same night, they must roast the meat over a fire and eat it along with bitter salad greens and bread made without yeast. And we talked about in one of the earlier Bible studies that this instruction I think it was last week, to eat bread without leaven is because leaven is a symbol of sin. So leaven is what causes things to rise or to puff things up, and this unleavened bread is a symbol of humility, because pride puffs us up. And so eating this unleavened bread is showing like a humility, and it's also as leaven symbolizes sin. It's showing that we must present ourselves before God without sin. Okay. Let's see, where am I here? Do not eat any of the meat raw or boiled in water. The whole animal, including the head, legs, and internal organs, must be roasted over the fire. Do not leave any of it until the next morning. Burn whatever is not eaten before morning. These are your instructions for eating the meal. Be fully dressed. Wear your sandals and carry your walking stick in your hand. Eat the meal with urgency, for this is the Lord's Passover. On that night I will pass through the night of Egypt and strike down every firstborn son and firstborn male animal in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. But the blood on your doorposts will serve as a sign, marking the houses where you are staying. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. This plague of death will not touch you when I strike the land of Egypt. This is a day to remember. Each year, from generation to generation, you must celebrate it as a special festival to the Lord. This is a law for all time. For 7 days, the bread you eat must be made without yeast. On the first day of the festival, remove every trace of yeast from your homes. Anyone who eats bread made with yeast during the 7 days of the festival will be cut off from the community of Israel. On the first day of the festival, and again on the 7th day, all the people must observe an official day for holy assembly. No work of any kind may be done on these days except in preparation of food. So this is something to remember, okay? So this right here in verse 16, on the first day of the festival, and again on the 7th day, all the people must observe an official day for a holy assembly, no work of any kind. So this is we are familiar with the Jewish Sabbath as being on a Saturday, but it was not the only days where there was no work allowed and that was considered a Sabbath. And one of these days, so we see here in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 7-day celebration, that the first day, which would be Nisan 15, and then the last day are also considered Sabbaths. Celebrate this festival of unleavened bread, for it will remind you that I brought your forces out of the land of Egypt on this very day. This festival will be a permanent law for you. Celebrate this day from generation to generation. The bread you eat must be made without yeast from the evening of the 14th day of the first month until the evening of the 21st day of that month. During those 7 days, there must be no trace of yeast in your homes. Anyone who eats anything made of yeast during this week will be cut off from the community of Israel. These regulations apply both to foreigners living among you and to native-born Israelites. During those days, you must not eat anything made with yeast. Wherever you live, eat only bread made without yeast. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel together and said to them, Go pick out a lamb or young goat from each of your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Drain the blood into a basin. Then take a bunch of hyssop branches and dip it into the blood. Brush the hyssop across the top and sides of the door frames of your houses, and no one may go out through the door until morning. For the Lord will pass through the land to strike down the Egyptians, but when he sees the blood on the tops and side of the doorframe, the Lord will pass over your home. He will not permit his death angel to enter your house and strike you down. Remember, these instructions are a permanent law that you and your descendants must observe forever. When you enter the land the Lord has promised to give you, you will continue to observe this ceremony. Then all your children will ask, What does this ceremony mean? And you will reply, It is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord. For he passed over your houses, the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, and though he struck the Egyptians, he spared our families. When Moses had finished speaking, all the people bowed down to the ground and worshipped. So the people of Israel did just as the Lord had commanded through Moses and Aaron, and that night at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn sons in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sat in his throne to the firstborn son of the lowliest son of the prisoner in the dungeon. Even the firstborn of their livestock were killed, Pharaoh and all his officials. And all the people of Israel woke up during the night, and loud wailing was heard throughout the land of Egypt. There was not a single house where someone had not died. And then after that, because Pharaoh had been keeping, he would not let them go. And so Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron during the night. Get out, he ordered. Leave my people and take the rest of the Israelites with you. Go and worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you said, and be gone. Go, but bless me as you leave. And the Egyptians urged the people of Israel to get out of the land as quickly as possible, for they thought, we will all die. So the Israelites took the bread dough before the yeast was added. They wrapped their kneading boards on their cloaks and carried them on their shoulders. And all the people of Israel did as Moses had instructed. They asked the Egyptians for clothing and articles of silver and gold. The Lord caused the Egyptians to look favorably on all the Israelites, and they gave the Israelites whatever they asked for. So they stripped the Egyptians of their wealth. So this is something that, it's actually, we're coming up on Easter. Passover this year starts on the evening of Wednesday the 8th and it goes for a week. So as I mentioned in one of the other Bible studies, Jewish festivals and holidays, they start in the evening and then they go into the next day, because, in Genesis it said in the evening and the morning was the first day. So when they are talking about, the preparation of Passover, so on the 14th day of the month, that is where in the afternoon, I actually looked this up on the Jewish Encyclopedia site, they would sacrifice the lamb after a particular sacrifice, and so the sacrifice was at 3 p.m., which is what the Gospels say, the time when Jesus died, and we'll be covering that, I think, next week. But it also, if the day was born, and this is just to put a little bee in your bonnet, if the day fell before the Sabbath, so if it would be the weekly Sabbath, they would do it an hour earlier. So anyway, there was this huge, basically like a plague, right, that just swept throughout the entire land. And there was this distinct, obvious difference between those that God had favor on and those that he didn't. Those who put their trust in him and those who were following other gods. And so that was showing the Egyptians that Yahweh has power over life and death, and none of their gods could help them against him. And so just imagine what that's like, because we're going through a time of, a pandemic right now. And, I don't know anybody close to me, but I know of a couple of people that have tested positive. I don't know anybody that's in the hospital, but just imagine what that's like to have every single family that that loses somebody. Just imagine what that would be like. Now, there's, this isn't, I have a post on my site called Habakkuk's Prayer for Fear. And in it, I share a graph that someone else has put together showing a graphical representation of the death toll of different pandemics in the past 2,000 years. What we're seeing right now is just a very small, scope compared to so many others that have happened. For example, the bubonic plague of the Black Death. I mean, that, like, I think it was like 200. I have to go back and look. I think it was like 200 million people that died. I mean, it was just so widespread and so destructive that it really shaped culture. And so just imagine what that's like. You have to try to put it in perspective. And so there was such a clear picture that the Israelites were the ones that were favored by God. So it really kind of struck a fear into the hearts of the Egyptians. And they gave them whatever they want. Not only did they let them go, but they gave them pretty much, it sounded like almost everything of value that they had, they gave to them while they were out going on their way. So what does this have to do with Easter? So this is actually, Nisan 14 is the day that Jesus was tried and the day he was crucified, because Jesus is God's, the Lamb of God. He is the true Passover lamb. All of this was just a foreshadowing of Jesus' first coming as a savior of the world. And so the spring feasts of the Jewish festival, they foreshadow Jesus' first coming, just as the fall feasts foreshadow his second coming. So I've heard some people say, well, it's, this is just the weirdest thing to me. Some people have said that Easter is pagan, and I'm thinking, and even some people who think that they're being like Torah observant, like, how do you miss the whole connection between Passover and the crucifixion and the resurrection and first fruits? How do you miss that? Especially when Paul and the writers clearly line it out. I mean, they explain it to you. It's not a mystery. So it's really kind of odd. Now, because all four Gospels give an account of the Last Supper. So this is where a little controversy comes in. Some people say the Last Supper with Jesus and his disciples was not a Passover meal, even though it does say that they were celebrating the Passover. So there's confusion about that. However, here's the thing. During the time of Jesus, there were different sects of Jews, and there was the one group called the Essenes, who we have the writings from the Qumran's cache, Dead Sea Scrolls, and they actually, so the main body of Jews celebrated according to a lunar calendar, and they calculated the feast under that calendar. The Essenes actually calculated it as a lunar solar calendar. So their new year was actually calculated off the vernal equinox, which is the same way that at the Council of Nicaea, when they decided, because before that the church had basically been basing the timing of Easter off of when the Jews had calculated Passover to be. They did not, because at the time of Jesus, they calculated by actually watching the moon and seeing when the new moon was. It wasn't until a few hundred years later, after the time of the Council of Nicaea, that the Jews themselves moved to a calculated calendar rather than actually watching the cycle of the moon. However, the Essenes did not follow that calendar. They did a 364-day calendar rather than 360. So they actually had worshipped observed their festivals based on a different calendar. And they weren't doing it on the same day. So it's similar to us, where you have the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Church, and we go off of different calendars, because the Eastern Orthodox Church follows the Julian calendar and we follow the Gregorian. So sometimes there'll be as much as a month between when we're celebrating Easter and when they are. It's the same sort of thing. Right? I have a blog post on my site. It's called Where Did Our Easter Traditions Come From? I'll link to it. But the reason that, so Jesus died on Nisan 14, which was the day before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? So that day up until 6 p.m. or sundown, when it was, that was considered Nisan 14, and then they would start observance for the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 15th, which started in the evening. So that day, so there's actually people who there's a lot of controversy over, how the Gospels present it. I personally don't think it's that hard to understand, because this is going to be controversial. I'm pretty positive that Jesus was actually crucified on a Wednesday rather than a Friday, because so if you've ever looked at any of the calculations for what day of the week certain days fall on, usually people are so fixated on a Friday crucifixion that they won't actually, I just saw one today, they won't actually say what that day is calculated to be, because the year Jesus died, all of the indicators that we have as far as chronological points in time point to his crucifixion and resurrection in 30 AD. The problem is, for most people, like if depending on how you calculate the calendars, and it is kind of like one of those tricky things, but the problem is that most calculations calculate that out to be Wednesday, and people are fixated on Jesus dying on a Friday. So it doesn't actually say in the Gospels that he died on a Friday. It said the day before the Sabbath. And keep in mind that first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was also a Sabbath. So I talk about that more in the blog post on my site. So anyway, as far as that goes, then they also had in the Last Supper. So then you say, well, how could that be a Passover Seder if when they would normally be observing the Passover Seder would be on the night of the 14th. So the thing to keep in mind is that, again, the Jews, the Essenes and the rest of the Jews celebrated on different days. And on that post on my site, I do have links to a couple of resources where they're saying that the Essene observance of the Feast of Unleavened Bread actually fell a day before. So it would have been the Nisan 14, if Nisan 14 fell on a Wednesday and Jesus was crucified then that evening would have been when all the rest of the Jews would have been having their Passover meal, right? And then you go from Wednesday evening to Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and that's 3 days and 3 nights. And it says the women went to the tomb early on the morning of, on Sunday. So anyway, they would have been, if the Essene observance of Passover was a day before, then the disciples would have still been observing a Passover. So anyway, there's different, all 4 Gospels give an account of that. In John 13, 1 through 38 is Mark 14, 7 through 26, Matthew 26, 20 through 30, and then Luke 22, verses, I think 14 through 30, and it gives an account of the disciples observing, their Passover meal. So how Mark puts it, and as Mark and Matthew both say, it's the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So some people see that as a contradiction, but it would have been if you read the Gospels and if you read any research about that festival, it's also called, it's called Passover. So they refer to this whole week long and all the activities as this one, kind of like a single observance almost. So you have the preparation day would have been the day leading into that evening where they're having the Passover meal, and then that Nisan 15 would have been a high holy day. It would have been a Sabbath. So the other ones talk about the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I mean, that kind of is, like, depending on who they're addressing it to. So keep in mind that the time range and the audience is for each of the gospel. So Mark was the earliest one written. We don't know exactly when it was written. As I mentioned, I've mentioned this several times before. Nabil Qureshi thought it was written at about 38 AD, which would have been really early. And it was, the audience is to the Jews who would already have this understanding about how the celebration worked. I don't think I've seen anybody that says that they think that it was written after 70 AD. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, there's all people who have all different opinions. And then Matthew and Luke. Matthew was written to Jews. We're not really sure when. And then Luke was written, it sounds like more like a Greek audience. He says, like, in that part, that the Passover was approaching, so he doesn't even really talk about specifics, but they do say that Jesus and his disciples were observing a Passover meal. John was the last gospel written, and was, he was released from the island of Patmos probably around 95 AD. Right. He went to Ephesus, and he lived out the remainder of his life, and he wrote the Gospel of John. So he is actually, his audience are probably Gentiles who aren't as familiar with Jewish practices, because this is after the destruction of the temple. Everyone's dispersed out, so they're not, probably don't have a real clear firsthand witness to how those things, and he's actually kind of specific about it. He calls it the day of preparation. They're preparing for the Passover, so they're approaching this time when, again, like the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was going to be on, it was a high holy day, it was a Sabbath. So as far as the other dialogue about the the Passover and the observance of the death and resurrection of Christ. This actually was one of the one of the first church-wide controversies, and it was called the Quartodeciman controversy. So John and his disciples observed Nisan 14, so the day that Jesus died, while the disciples of Peter and Paul they observed the Sunday of the resurrection. So it would have been first fruits, and we'll talk about that next week. And so there was this huge controversy. There's, accounts about how some of their disciples got together and they were arguing back and forth about, which one was better and who should do what. And so as we know, because, we don't always have a specific date for Easter, it's because it's this rolling date. They argued about that for the first, 300 years. So at the Council of Nicaea, this is in 325, up until the time of Constantine, the church had been under persecution. There were basically 10 different big persecutions, but even between the time of active persecutions, they really didn't they were kind of like secondary citizens. They just were really not that well regarded. And so when it was finally not illegal to be a Christian anymore, and when the church could start, kind of having these councils in public, there was what brought about the Council of Nicaea was the Arian controversy, which didn't believe that he believed that Jesus was created and not of the same essence and eternal as God. So it was kind of subordinationism a little bit. And so that was the main reason that the Council of Nicaea was called, and the main thing that they were deciding. But they also decided how to observe Easter, because what would happen is that before, when the temple was in place and you had the high priests and they were watching the moon, and they would all of the Jews observed their Passover on the same day, and the church was observing it based on that. But what would happen is you had all these different congregations or in synagogues that were observing different days, and then sometimes it was like way later, and so the church was, they weren't worshiping in unity. There's one account that says that, the Jews would kind of needle them a little bit, like, you can't even observe your holiday without us, because you don't even know. And so they divorced they didn't deny the reason and the connection to the Passover, but what they divorced was tying it to when the Jews said that it was, because it was at all different times, within the Roman Empire. And so they wanted to be able to worship in unity on the same day. And so that's when they decided to base it on the vernal equinox, which, as I mentioned, is exactly the way the Essenes calculated their calendar. So anyway, and they decided to do it on the Sunday of the resurrection, which had always been known as the Lord's Day. And the other interesting thing about this is that in the Didache, which is one of the earliest documents of the church, or some people who date it to 50 AD, and I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but it's really interesting. It actually gives a Jewish version of the golden rule rather than the one that's in the gospel. So we know the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? And so the one that like Hillel and the other Jewish rabbis were putting forward was, do not do to someone else what you wouldn't have them to do to them. So it's really kind of more, it sounds similar, but it's different because it's more passive. And so there's not this, Jesus's rule was like, it's more active. You have to be proactively caring for others rather than just sitting back and not, doing wrong. So anyway, in the Didache, it said that the only Sabbath to observe was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's the only one. And it just, that and a lot of other things really kind of blow to bits the Sabbatarian assertion that the Apostolic Church worshipped on Saturdays. It just don't. I mean, it's just, there's no case for it at all. Not at all. I mean, you read the patristic fathers, the earliest things that we have, even in the New Testament, it shows that they worshipped and observed on Sunday because it was the day that Jesus rose from the dead. It's this weekly observance. And they also didn't tie themselves to Jewish observance. They only observed the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's from the Didache. They think it was written in 50 AD. It's kind of like how to do church manual for the Apostolic Church. So anyway, I hope that kind of gives an overview of just how far, how Easter is actually rooted back in Exodus. And sometimes you see things out there, they're like, oh, well, Easter is this German god or something. I can't even remember. It's called Easter in Germanic countries. It's not what they call it in other countries. It was known as Pascha, which is basically coming from, the Paschal Sunday. So there's always been, it does not have pagan roots. It's always come from this, this biblical promise of God's Passover lamb. So anyway, I hope that explains things. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm going to link to some of the other resources on Easter and Passover that I have on my site. And if you have any other questions, be sure to just send me a note. But anyway, I hope you have a great week. And let's just end this time with a prayer. Lord, I thank you so much for this day. And we thank you, Lord, that you are our Passover lamb, that you are our Savior and our Redeemer. And you are a deliverer from every situation. Help us remember that not only during Easter, but for every day. And please help us be able to share the hope of the gospel with those who are living in fear. We thank you, Lord, for everything that you've done for us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, well, I will see you next week.